as has been said, we now move to the final session. I'd like to introduce our colleagues, the two former British ambassadors to Ankara. Kieran Prendergast, who was in post when I was in my first job in Ankara, and I always wanted to thank him for his kindness and generosity and welcome that he gave me in Ankara. And to Dominic Chilcott, more recently, I wasn't in Ankara, I was due there, but David, of course, did know me there. And so I now turn over to our two distinguished speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we now move from what you might call academic expertise to practitioners, and therefore almost by definition non-experts. You suggested in the note you sent me, David, that I say a word or two about David, personal reminiscences. Before I went to Turkey, Tim Dawn suggested that David would be a good person to consult and keep in touch with, and I did. My most memorable encounter with him was when he took me to a very obscure restaurant about 30 miles from Ankara because they served fresh crayfish. And I'd never eaten crayfish in Turkey before, and I've never eaten them since. But it didn't make me sick, so I suppose it was a success. We had fairly, well, always cordial relations, except possibly for one occasion when he took me to a meeting with Özdem Sandberg in Özdem's flat, at which Ilter Türkmen was also present. And David was fulminating against the introduction of the Imam Hatip school, and I said to him, well, David, don't fulminate too much, because you and I both went to madrasas, in the sense that we both went to Catholic boarding schools. And he did not appreciate that. And as Serdar Künarov said, he was out of love with the kind of sliding reversal of secularism in Turkey and the gradual unraveling of Ataturk's reforms. I tried to argue with him that quite a lot of this was healthy, in that Turkey was no longer to be run by the sort of the guardian class of white Turks, that the ordinary people of Anatolia and their wishes were to be more represented, that things like the ban on the headscarf were not necessary to maintain secularism, but David was almost more secularist than Ataturk would have been. And that, I think, explains his slight falling out with the way things were going in Turkey. But I always enjoyed him. I received his email accounts of what was going on, and I thought he was remarkably well informed, and we shall miss him greatly. As we shall also miss it. I feel I'm 81, but I'm at a turning point. I mean, we've lost David, we've lost Andrew Mango, we've lost Timothy, and now Patricia Daunt. And the young ones are, they're still pretty young, you know. The young ones are now coming up to succeed them. What I regret, by the way, as a former ambassador, is that we are at the risk of breaking the chain of ambassadors whose first posting was to Turkey as a language student. Because I think that being a Turkolog is quite a big advantage for an ambassador. Dominic and I have slightly similar careers. We both started as language students in Turkey. We were both private secretaries to two foreign secretaries. One of them a shit, one of them quite agreeable, in each case, I should say. And we were both ambassadors to Turkey. And with that, I hand you over to a much more expert hands.
Kieran Escarfield. Ladies and gentlemen, friends and allies of David Barchard, thank you to David Shankland for inviting me to take part in this Memorial Day for David, and to Professor Prendergast for hosting this event. It's also a singular honour to share a platform with someone as articulate and expert about these things as Sir Kieran. Now, I first met David in January 1985, having just started work as the lowest form of life in the Chancery of the British Embassy in Ankara, the post's solitary third secretary. In those days, the embassy was a lot smaller than it is today, and we all had to multitask. So as well as being the political section's gopher, I was also the embassy's press attaché, which is how my wife and I got to meet David, who was then writing for the Financial Times and I think also filing for the BBC. We saw quite a bit of each other over the next 3 years, and perhaps very early on I should have had a hint at what getting to know David would be like. Because when he discovered that, like him, I was a Catholic, he took me to a very obscure church downtown in Ullas somewhere, where there was a small congregation, and he said most of the congregation are in fact from Mitt. And it was a sort of, I never found this church again. And I look back on the internet, I'm not even sure it really existed. But somehow it brought together a kind of detailed knowledge of the nooks and crannies of Turkish society, with David's also appetite for conspiracy theory, and his generosity at showing a newly arrived, wet behind the ears, young British diplomat, something of hidden Ankara. Like many others, I enjoyed David's stimulating company enormously, and we became good friends. Professionally, I benefited hugely from his wisdom, his knowledge, and his insights. And when I returned to Ankara as ambassador in 2018, David and I had stayed in touch in the intervening years sufficiently for him to visit us on his way to or from Cappadocia, and to include me in the circulation of his astonishingly well-informed and erudite emails about contemporary events in Turkey. At times, as others have noted, particularly David, he seemed to be able to follow from his home in Yorkshire, and all by himself, the twists and turns of Turkey's domestic affairs better than I could with a small army of officials to support me in embassy. As we all know, one of David's most strongly held beliefs was the importance of Turkey fulfilling the vision of the founder of the Republic, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, and increasingly integrating itself into the West and adopting the freedoms and the disciplines of a Western liberal democracy. During the Cold War, the emphasis was on Turkey's NATO membership, though we shouldn't overlook the fact that Turkey was also a founder member of the Council of Europe. Having the second largest armed forces in NATO and a land border with the Soviet Union meant that Turkey made a highly valuable contribution to the alliance's deterrence posture vis-à-vis the Kremlin. But after the end of the Cold War, closer relations with, and eventually membership of the European Union became the much sought-after prize. The seed had been sown back in 1963 when Turkey signed its association agreement with the then European Economic Community. That agreement envisaged the possibility of Turkey joining the EEC one day. The Turks have always argued since then that they have a contractual agreement with the now European Union, that they should belong and find their place one day inside the European family of free nations. The Commission have also accepted this point, even when they responded to Turkey's application to join in 1987 by saying Turkey was not ready for the opening of membership negotiations. The Commission acknowledged Turkey's eligibility to accede to the bloc when the conditions were right, and suggested the matter should be revisited in 1995. That contrasted with the Commission's dismissal of an application from Morocco in the same year, where the Commission spelt out that Morocco was geographically not a European country, something which might not need it, one has thought to be spelt out, and therefore was ineligible. So the issue of principle, that Turkey had the right to attempt to join the European Union, has not really been in doubt. The borders of Europe do not stop at the edge of Western Thrace or in the Aegean Sea. David set out the advantages to Turkey of membership in a short book called Building a Partnership, Turkey and the European Union, published in the year 2000, and written in the wake of the decision by EU heads to grant Turkey the status of a candidate country. It felt at the time as though a real breakthrough had been achieved. David listed those advantages as higher standards of living, freedom to engage in travel and dialogue, not only with the advanced industrial countries of Western Europe, from which Turks are largely shut out at the moment, but also other Mediterranean countries. He added that EU membership could also help resolve many of Turkey's deepest preoccupations. Its external security situation would look quite different from inside the European Union. Internal order would be better guaranteed. Turkey could follow the examples of Portugal, Greece and Spain, 3 EU member states dogged by fierce polarisation until they joined the European Union. Turkish membership would also bring significant benefits to the European Union, David believed. In his monograph on Turkey and the European Union, published in early 1998, David wrote that Turkey's visibility and impact on Europe are rising steadily. A generation ago, Turkey mattered because of its military and strategic importance. Today, Turkey touches Europe in virtually every domain. There is no other East European or Near Eastern country, with the possible exception of Israel, David continued, whose internal problems are so likely to spill out in ways harmful to Western interests. Thus, the European Union's ties to Turkey should be as close as possible, and it should be firmly integrated into the life of Europe. In other words, it was manifestly in the interests of both the EU and Turkey that Ankara's ambition to become a member state should succeed. To use David's words again, the move to include Turkey within the greater European Union, now being constructed, may be essential to the long-term stability and prosperity of the region, not least since Turkey, and more precisely Istanbul and its hinterland, have returned to its ancient role of economic hub of Southeast Europe. Now, in the 20-plus years since David wrote his monographs, Turkey's importance to the West has increased as Turkey's neighbourhood has become more unstable. The end of the Cold War, the breakup of the Soviet Union, the US-led interventions in Kuwait and Iraq, the series of wars in Afghanistan, and the Arab Spring have unleashed huge nationalist, religious fundamentalist, and revolutionary social forces that have shaken the region. In September 2015, the then British Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond referred to the conflicts in Syria, Iraq, and Ukraine as constituting an arc of instability for Europe. To those conflicts, one could have added Nagorno-Karabakh, Libya, and Israel-Palestine, as well as the slow-moving collapse of the administration in Lebanon and the periodic spikes in tension in the eastern Mediterranean. Turkey has troops on the ground in Cyprus, Iraq, Syria, and Libya. It has provided weapons and other defense material to Azerbaijan and Ukraine. Its diplomats are active in all the conflicts and regional tensions I have mentioned. Crucially for the European Union and for Britain, Turkey absorbs and tempers much of the consequences of instability in its region and cushions those countries to its west from their worst effects. A stark example of one of those consequences of regional instability is irregular migration. Turkey, following its agreement in March 2016 with the EU, is essentially now expected to guard the EU's southeastern border from outside the EU, preventing people from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, and elsewhere from moving clandestinely into Greece and onwards to other European Union member states. The burden Turkey bears in doing this is considerable. It's home to perhaps, at a conservative estimate, 5 million irregular migrants, the majority of whom are Syrians, integrated at a significant cost into Turkey's education, health, housing, and social security systems. In return, the European Union pays an amount towards these costs. 6 billion euros was foreseen in the 2016 agreement. EU leaders decided to add another 3 billion euros in June 2021. But although those numbers look large, they're almost certainly less than the costs of the Turkish exchequer, of Turkey hosting so many refugees. So I believe we owe Turkey a great debt of gratitude for its generosity in hosting so many refugees, and we shouldn't be surprised when its patience in doing so occasionally is tested to the limit. And it's a pity that sometimes the only issue on which the dialogue between the European Union and Turkey has looked serious and purposeful in recent years has been when it's on irregular migration. It should be self-evident that the European Union and those Western European countries not in the bloc, such as the United Kingdom, it should be self-evident that we should all try to play a stabilising and constructive constructive role in our part of the world, and should therefore try to work as closely as possible with the Turks on all these regional issues, where Ankara is generally more engaged and more influential because they're closer to the action than we are. It seems odd that the dialogue between Brussels and Ankara on international affairs is not closer. The Turkish Foreign Minister is still not invited to the informal meetings of EU foreign ministers, the Gimniks, despite the normal practice being to invite the foreign ministers of candidate countries. Ladies and gentlemen, when David wrote his papers on Turkey and the European Union, he foresaw a number of problems that would need to be resolved before Turkey might one day in the future be able to advance its case. These included the strength of its economy, the quality of its democracy, including human rights and the rule of law, Islamism versus secularism, the PKK and the Kurds, the stance of three key EU states towards Turkey's membership ambitions, Cyprus, Greece and Germany. And it might be interesting to look at some of these briefly. First, on the economy, where David was broadly optimistic. That optimism was based on the known strengths of the Turkish economy, a large productive agricultural sector, the huge potential for tourism, a well-trained and disciplined industrial workforce, and, since 1995, seamless access to the EU single market for manufactured goods through its bespoke customs union with the EU. Turkey's economy was well ahead of those of the countries of Central Europe in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when those countries were applying to join the bloc in parallel to Turkey. This is not to claim that everything in Turkey's economic garden was rosy. Inflation was very high in the late 1990s and is of course again today. Per capita income was much lower than the European average. The difference in wealth between the industrialised west of the country and the largely agricultural east and southeast was striking. But these problems all seemed fixable in the light of the rapid transformation of the Turkish economy that was taking place in the late 1990s. Nevertheless, in 1998, David observed that the customs union between Turkey and the EU had, for the most part, worked much better than anyone dared hope. This is a remarkable tribute to the progress made by the Turkish economy. That transformational progress continued in the early years of the AKP government. In 2001, according to the IMF, GDP per capita was just over $3,000 in Turkey. By 2013, it had reached $12,500. In other words, it had more than quadrupled. However, as observers of Turkey know well, the years after 2013 proved more difficult. The causes are various. The end of the PKK's ceasefire in 2015, the failed 2016 coup and the clampdown afterwards, the move to a presidential system and the weakening of institutions, Russia's economic sanctions against Turkey, President Trump's threats to the economy, and Turkey's own idiosyncratic economic management of recent years have all played their part in spooking the markets. Consequently, by the year 2020, GDP per capita had fallen to $8,600. Things look better now, however, as the figure has recently ticked up and stands at over $13,000. But that means today Turkey ranks only slightly higher than Bulgaria in GDP per capita, but is below all the other 26 EU member states, and Turkey's GDP per capita is only about 1/3 of the EU average. These figures reflect current foreign exchange rates. Ankara might argue that given the dramatic fall of the Turkish lira against the dollar in the last 5 years, that measure unfairly depresses the wealth of Turks, and comparisons based on purchasing power parity would indicate a smaller gap. Ironically, it's a Turkish-American academic, Professor Darren Acemoglu, who co-wrote with James Robinson Why Nations Fail, the textbook on the connection between bad governance, weak institutions, and economic collapse, who's pointed out the path forwards that Turkey needs to avoid. The appointment of Mehmet Şimşek as Finance and Economy Minister after the May election has been heralded by some, not least by him, as the return to rational economic policy making. Whether he and the new governor of the central bank will be given the time and the freedom of manoeuvre to turn things around is moot. The markets remain to be convinced, and local elections next spring are not an ideal background for fiscal discipline. But given the inherent strengths of the Turkish economy, this is an area where the right policies and strong independent institutions should, in the medium to long term, bear fruit. It's more difficult to be similarly optimistic when considering the state of Turkey's democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. David argued in the late 1990s and early 2000s that things looked worse from outside the country than they appeared to be to the ordinary Turk on the Kadıköy ferry. It's true that, especially thanks to social media, the visitor to Turkey is struck by how lively and colourful debate in the country appears. There is plenty of criticism available of government policies, if that's an indication of the health of democratic debate. And elections remain genuinely competitive, even if the playing field for campaigning is tilted heavily in the government's favour. Significant progress was made in the first decade of the AKP government on human rights. Torture that had been systematic was largely eradicated, and the death penalty was abolished in 2004. Attainment of the Copenhagen political criteria, that Turkey should be a stable democracy that applied the rule of law, looked within reach then, and that was the basis on which the EU agreed in 2004 to start membership negotiations with Turkey. But from the suppression of the 2013 Gezi Park protests onwards, the direction of travel on human rights and the rule of law, though by no means in a straight line at all times, has been generally in the wrong direction. The state of emergency measures taken after the 2016 failed coup have accelerated that trend. The present Turkish administration no longer argues that it's trying to meet the Copenhagen criteria. But David would not lay all the blame for this democratic backsliding at Ankara's feet. He always argued that the European Union needed to give Turkey encouragement to make and maintain the profound changes required for membership. And by and large, that encouragement has not been forthcoming. The EU did not invite Turkey to any of its summits after 2004 until the migration crisis in 2016. France passed a law aimed at Turkey explicitly that required a referendum to be taken in France before France would ratify any additional enlargements of the European Union. Worse, although accession negotiations formally began in 2005, they were handicapped and then effectively sabotaged by a number of member states who either didn't want Turkey ever to join or wanted to put pressure on Turkey over Cyprus. As early as 2007, the Commissioner in charge of enlargement, Olli Rehn, warned of an impending train crash in the accession negotiations with Turkey. David deprecated the position of President Sarkozy that Turkey's joining the EU was unthinkable, and the position of Chancellor Merkel that Turkey should have a privileged partnership with the EU instead of membership. Despite the UK's pretty steady support for Turkish membership in principle, even David Cameron, in the white heat of the Brexit referendum campaign in 2016, argued that Turkey's joining the EU was something that was simply never going to happen. A more serious spanner in the works of Turkey's accession plans was wielded by Cyprus. David saw this coming. In 1998, he argued that the European decision to negotiate the entry of Cyprus to the European Union has all the hallmarks of an historical blunder. If the EU admitted Cyprus, it would be putting the wishes of a microstate of 650,000 people of little strategic value above those of a crucial strategic and trading partner with a population 100 times larger. He was not a man to mince his words, as we know. David did not expect his warnings to be heeded, however. He also wrote that it seemed most likely that despite many hesitations, the EU will eventually admit the Greek Cypriots, thereby importing the Cyprus dispute into its own body. The effect of Cyprus's accession, he wrote, may be to divide the island permanently and to bring the EU into permanent confrontation with Turkey. This has proved to be, so far sadly, a remarkably prescient prophecy. Many Europeans, in private, would agree that allowing Cyprus to join, without the condition that it should have first supported in a referendum the UN Secretary-General's plan for resolving the division of the island, was a strategic error that has both dripped poison into the relations between the EU and Turkey since, and led to a state of affairs where Ankara no longer sees any future in a bizonal, bicommunal federation between the Greek and Turkish Cypriots. For their part, the Greek Cypriots, and indeed the present Greek government, have largely succeeded in making their bilateral problems with Turkey the EU's problems with Turkey, something of a diplomatic success. This will have helped self-confidence in Nicosia and Athens in their dealings with the Turks. But it's at least a question about whether it actually helps the search for solutions to their disputes with Ankara, since it must surely remove some of the incentive, or at least some of the feeling, that compromises need to be taken. The increasingly clear pro-Greek positions over its disputes with Turkey, taken by the French government and by Washington, may also fuel a sentiment in Athens that compromise with Turkey is unnecessary. David noted the parallel that the admission of Greece to the EU in 1981 was followed by an upsurge in ultra-nationalist politics in Greece, which might not have happened without EU membership, making that country more secure and more self-confident. However, there have been recently slightly more encouraging signs that both parties in this relationship recognise they are heading into a strategic dead end and need to find a way out. Competing nationalisms in the Eastern Mediterranean and the tensions they create unsettle foreign investors, to give but one reason for everyone trying a bit harder to find common ground. As for the Kurdish issue in Turkey, it seems very unlikely that the hold that Turkish nationalism has at the moment in Ankara will allow a return to the 2013-2015 peace process. The Turkish state has essentially defeated the PKK inside Turkey and seems determined to take the fight to the PKK in northern Iraq and Syria. And the political party most popular amongst the Kurds in southeast Turkey and across the country, now known as HDP, continues to be accused by pro-government news outlets of being hand in glove with the PKK, the Kurdish terrorist organisation. Experience suggests that making peace with the PKK in 2013-2015 may have lost the AKP votes, while going all out to defeat them militarily is popular in the country. It's often said that President Erdogan can persuade his followers to support him in any policy he chooses, but some acts of persuasion are undoubtedly more difficult than others. Now, a different area where David seemed more pessimistic than necessary, seemed to me more pessimistic than necessary, was on the government's so-called Islamist agenda. He was very worried at the growing influence of a sort of puritanical version of Islam inside some of Turkey's ministries, the education system, etc. And he saw an active plan to roll back the secular norms established by Ataturk. The world of Islamic sects and tarikats in Turkey was one he understood much better than any other non-Turk I met. But for what it's worth, my observation from living in Turkey recently was that the draw of a secular lifestyle continued to be stronger than a conservative religious one to most young people, and particularly those living in cities. Ataturk remains a hugely popular figure across the political spectrum in Turkey, and especially with the young. If the AKP government once had an Islamist agenda, it no longer seems to me at least that it's being pursued much beyond the odd gesture, such as the return of Hagia Sophia to being a mosque. The secular constitution continues to be lauded as a great achievement of the Republic, even by the present government, and the likelihood of Turkey adopting Sharia law seems remote in the extreme. So, where does all this leave EU-Turkey relations today? It's hard not to sound rather gloomy. The accession negotiations are moribund, though neither side wants to be the one that declares the corpse dead. Selim Yenel, a former Turkish ambassador to the European Union, who now heads the Global Relations Forum, the think tank in Istanbul, has recently argued, and who knows probably more about EU-Turkey relations than any other person on the planet, has recently argued that Turkey should stop arguing for EU membership, which the EU or some of its member states will always find a reason to prevent, and focus instead on other goals such as visa exemption, updating the customs union, and foreign policy and defence cooperation. And for its part, he says, Turkey should take steps to protect its democracy, uphold the rule of law, and implement the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. Now, whether even that limited set of goals is achievable in the present circumstances is unknown. Cyprus, supported by some other member states, is likely to ask Turkey to pay a price for opening customs union negotiations that Ankara will refuse to pay, even though an updated customs union would benefit all parties. And it's at least an open question whether Turkey's authoritarian trend will be reversed, or whether high-profile prisoners like Osman Kavala and Selahattin Demirtas will be released in line with European Court of Human Rights judgments. However, since it is clearly in both sides' interest to cooperate where they can find common ground, in the light of the huge challenges the world faces, and for the mutual security and prosperity of their peoples, one must hope that a degree of pragmatism will win through. The alternative is what David described in his paper published in the year 2000 of an accession partnership process that has stopped being a partnership in practice and become a political contest dominated by pressures and confrontations. That's not the future David wanted for Europe or for Turkey, and escaping that future is the challenge governments and diplomats of goodwill must now embrace. Thank you very much.
Well, I enjoyed that.
High praise indeed.
And I agree with every word you said. I must say I was ambassador in 1995, which is when I think I made the deal to admit Cyprus in principle without making a settlement of the Cyprus problem on pre-condition. And in return there was to be some sort of customs agreement and economic benefits for Turkey, on which the Greeks immediately reneged. And I wrote to the Foreign Office at the time that this was setting the scene for an inevitable road crash. Now, the Europeans could have prevented that, even having made that agreement, because at the end of the Cyprus negotiations, by which time I was the official of the UN principally responsible for the Cyprus problem, the Europeans could have said, before we conclude this, kindly tell us how you are going to apply the acquis communautaire in the northern part of the island. To which the answer is, we can't apply it unless there is a settlement. In which case the Europeans could have said, well, kindly go back and try again, because we're not letting you in until they would do that. But as Dominic said, the lineup in the European Union was such as to be more pro-Greek Cypriot and more pro-Greece than to be pro-Turkish or pro-Turkish Cypriot. And that's the fact one had to live with. In fact, when the special envoy who was responsible for the Cyprus negotiations at the UN wrote a report in which he was extremely critical of the way things had gone, and it was submitted as a formal report of the Secretary General to the Security Council. It was never discussed in the Security Council. To my knowledge, it is the only report of the Secretary General on an item which is on the agenda of the Security Council, which was never discussed even in informals. You're too polite to say it, but the problem, Dominic, I'm much less of a diplomat than you. The problem is that there are key countries in the European Union that regard it as a Christian club. And they say Turkey is not Christian, therefore Turkey is not European. Even though the majority of ancient Greek artifacts and sites and so on are in modern Turkey, and you have countries like Cyprus, which are further away from Brussels than Ankara or Istanbul, and that is something which is very difficult to deal with. And I think the reason why the Copenhagen criteria are not a major factor is because what is the point of complying with the? Well, of course, you should comply with them for their own sake, but in terms of the European vocation, they are irrelevant because there is no roadmap that leads to full membership, because you've got these huge roadblocks in the way. You mentioned 3 countries, but then you mentioned France quite rightly, and there are others, I think, like the Czech Republic and so on. And Greece, in my time, has been quite often more of a help than a hindrance. For example, after the earthquake diplomacy of the century, there was and Simitis, when he was Prime Minister, was extremely helpful and pragmatic on Cyprus. When I was ambassador, we had a meeting of the ambassadors of the European Union, and I said, the Turks I talk to say, we don't care how long it takes, but we need to know what is the direction and what is the ultimate destination. So why don't we set a series of objective criteria and say that if the Turks meet those, then they will be admitted. And the German ambassador said, no, the problem is they might meet them. And that told you quite a lot about German attitudes. Now, we've got a few minutes for questions, because Dominic has been formidably well organised in what he said, and obviously took a lot of trouble over it. I'm afraid I didn't. So, who would like to comment or ask a question or disagree with something?
Can I disagree, Sir Kieran?
By all means.
Thank you.
You're going to disagree?
Yes, I will disagree with what you said about the criteria. I think, first of all, may thank all speakers for the most insightful, really, and informative papers or thoughts. But what struck me was that Sir Dominic's portrait of modern Turkey, though he was very careful to balance his words, was, I think, very rosy. What I would disagree was that the Greek Cypriots or the Greeks or indeed other powers, you are wiser than me, more experienced, and you're diplomats, of course, you know things and you have information that we have not been informed, that is the public. But I think that the problem here is the occupation by 100,000 of troops on the northern part of Cyprus. Now,
so are you a Cypriot?
Sorry?
Are you yourself a Cypriot or a Greek? Or
I am a Greek, and my name is Kieran, and I had the Hellenic Institute at Royal Holloway College of the University of London. Now, how would you feel, and this is not my argument, but an argument of an old journalist, I think, if Yorkshire or Surrey would be occupied by another force? Let's assume Belgium or perhaps France. And then France would call upon the foreign minister to negotiate. Would we negotiate? So here I will stop, because this is a question that has been troubling me for decades now. I know that history, we all know that history is within us. We try to be objective. We struggle with this. And as we grow, we can see the middle way, we can see the opinions of others. I do not condemn, I don't hate either the Turks or the British or the Americans or the Russians. We all know that governments, the main aim of the government is to serve the interests of the nation, of a country, and we do respect this. But as scholars and as citizens, we need to also serve other ideals. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to have a word before Dominic has a word. I would say that a question that's troubling me is why didn't the Greek Cypriots vote for the UN settlement plan, which had been very carefully negotiated. It achieved a majority among Turkish Cypriots of 55 to 45%, and among Greek Cypriots it was very heavily defeated. Now, if the UN plan had been adopted, I very much doubt whether there will be Turkish troops in Cyprus now. So I think you have to look and ask not just one question, but another question. And one of the interesting things for me was that when Erdogan came to power, it was very obvious that he didn't give a damn about Cyprus. As far as he was concerned, it was the size of a small and unimportant province of Turkey. He was the first one not to allow himself to be browbeaten by Denktash, because Denktash always felt that he could appeal over the heads of the government to the Turkish public. And for some reason, the chemistry between the two of them wasn't good, and Erdogan honestly couldn't give a damn about Cyprus or Mr. Denktash. And that's why it was possible to negotiate a settlement, which was rejected by the Greek Cypriots.
Can I answer to this?
Yeah, but briefly, because I want to move on to others.
I think that what prevailed was the psychological element, that is true, of not giving up the fight for what the Greek Cypriots regarded as just and also fair. I know that the English language makes a distinction between the two. So, and a fair solution, and a solution that would be lasting. This, I think, was at the forefront of their mind. On the other hand, the shadow of troops on the northern part does not help. You see, I think, this is my personal opinion, if Turkey would withdraw or announce the withdrawal of these troops in order to ease the psychological element, we had a war there. I would not, of course, get the details and the wrongs of all nations, and the powers that are the guarantor powers, and the interests of the British, the interests of Greece, the interests of Turkey, and so forth. So this is my answer to you. But I stand also of what you mentioned about President Erdogan and the phrase that you used, that he didn't give a damn. So I think that leaders and responsible leaders should give attention, because it is their responsibility not only, and this is what perhaps, as Churchill said, makes the distinction between a politician and a statesman. What is the luck, I think, in our days, perhaps you as diplomats and officials and with such an experience would agree, is that we lack such personalities, such statesmen that would put the overall good above their own parties and above the own, perhaps sometimes even nations, for the overall good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I don't really have very much to add. I mean, there was a plan that would have removed all but a handful of Turkish troops from the north. it was rejected in the south, as Kieran said. When I last visited the Cypriot Republic, I remember talking to the National Security Advisor of the President and talking to him about the nature of partnership on the island between the two communities, and asked him whether he could ever envisage a president of Cyprus after a solution who came from the Turkish Cypriot community. He said that was absolutely impossible. And I thought if you have that attitude, it's no wonder you're going to have two separate states.
Can I also say, sorry, just before we move on, that talking of statesmanship, there's been a striking absence of generosity and statesmanship on the Greek Cypriot side since the failure. For example, Turkish Cypriot agricultural products are, in practice, impossible to be exported to the European Union because the Cyprus government has refused to authorise any of the laboratories in the north to certify that they comply with EU standards. That is a measure that could be taken very, very easily, but they haven't done it because they have a policy of exerting maximum pressure, and all this does is perpetuate this gulf. Now we're going to move on to another subject, please.
Could you just remind us of Turkey's friends in Europe? Very brief thumbnail sketch and their motivations.
There you go.
Right. Well, actually, although the European Union, the relationship between Turkey and the European Union has been fraught with difficulty, Turkey's relations with individual member states sometimes can be quite good. And the relationship, I think, with Spain and with Italy, to name two, is pretty productive. They tend to be relationships based on commerce and the mutual benefits of commerce. But they go beyond that because, certainly in the Italian case, there's a strong interest in the defence sector and working with the Turkish defence sector. And I think those countries in Europe that take NATO more seriously and collective defence more seriously appreciate the role that Turkey plays there. So it's not all difficulty. I mean, there is, I think, along the Mediterranean there are a number of countries that work well with the Turks, and the Turks have good relations with. And of course, when the UK was a member state, we generally had a pretty good relationship with Turkey on most sides.
I think Italy has got a longer relationship with Turkey and before that the Ottoman Empire than most. I believe I'm right in saying that there was a treaty between Genoa and the Ottomans in 1300, 153 years before the fall of Constantinople. And if I could just go back to the last speaker and the question of where the Germans were more successful. I read somewhere, I'm not sure it wasn't in a book by Philip Mansell, to the effect that the dragoman, the German dragoman, because you know the diplomats, people like us, didn't speak Turkish, and we relied very heavily on the advice of Brits who were local, spoke Turkish, probably spoke Arabic, Greek, and all the rest of it. They were called dragomans, and they did the analysis and they gave the advice. And what I read was that the German dragomans were a great deal more astute at critical periods in the late 19th century than the Brits, particularly was it Sir Percy Fitzmaurice was not.
Charles de Testa was the German dragoman who was a legend at the time. And well, Sinan will know more about Fitzmaurice. He was not. He wasn't very realistic sometimes.
Can everybody hear?
No. Didn't hear the name.
Anyway, so that was.
I introduced when I was ambassador a sort of local employee of the month award, which we call the Dragoman of the Month award. You know, harking back to those days.
But we had some good dragomans, haven't we? More recently. Please, look on it.
Yes. I was wondering, well, it's almost taking the previous question a bit further. Who are natural allies for Turkey? I was discussing with David this, you know, what's he doing to put in all that vagaries, you know, before the Syrian plane shoot down, Russian plane shoot down, and then the fact that, you know, there's all this talk of Hakan Fidan and he's got something going with Iran, some kind of strange relationship. So are there any natural allies other than some wonky stans and Azerbaijan? I mean, you know, MBS is a rival. What does he want? What would they want to do with Iran? You know, is it just going to condemn?
So I was going to say exactly.
Yeah,
So there's a phrase, the only good friend of the Turk is the Turk. And there was an element of that. I mean, there are Turkish people in the audience who feel these sentiments much more strongly and or more authentically than I do. But if you look at there's a regular public opinion poll survey done of attitudes to foreign countries, which I used to read with glee when it came up, I think, every autumn, done by an Istanbul House University, I think. And I tried to find out whether the UK had moved from sort of second bottom to third bottom in this table to see whether I'd achieved anything in Anglo. The Americans, by the way, are always right at the very bottom. Amazingly, this is the country that most threatened Turkey as well, but at the same time, often the country that most Turkish people want to emigrate to. So there's this great kind of contradiction here. But
and Russia better than us.
and Russia does a lot better than we do at the moment. Although I haven't seen something since the Ukraine war, but I imagine Russia still does rather better than us. But at the top of the list are Turkish Cypriots and Azerbaijan. And the Turkish Cypriots are obviously kith and kin, and the Azerbaijanis are one people, two nations sort of thing. So there's a sense in which it's really all in the family. And I think after that, it depends a lot on
But
people's
what I mean
experience.
is it condemned to be a sort of semi-detached NATO member that's really a lone wolf?
Well, I think so. I think in terms of policy, under this president, who's now been at the head of government for over 20 years, I think he has a self-confidence about international affairs and dealing with his counterparts in other countries, and also a determination after feeling being let down a lot by Western powers and European powers, that he's going to pursue a much more hard-headed Turkish national interest in foreign policy, and you can hardly blame him for doing that. So he's not going to, Turkey's not going to pull out of NATO, but at the same time, Turkey's no longer going to slavishly, if that's the right word, follow a United States lead on all issues. It's going to make its own calculation where its interests lie. Furthermore, I think Turkey's realised that if it wants to change the political weather around its borders, and it's a very complicated geography, then it needs to get involved. So it's much more willing these days to put troops into foreign countries in order to try and change the balance of what's happening there and make it serve Turkey's interest better where in places like Syria or Libya, where it makes sense to do so.
I think, Dominic, I just wanted also to add the risk. One of the risks of these repeated rebuffs from the European Union is to strengthen what you might call the Eurasian trend among Turkish thinkers, particularly in the armed forces.
Yeah.
And I was told that one of the major reasons for the 2016 coup was these tensions between the pro-NATO elements in the armed forces and the Eurasian elements, and that it was the pro-NATO ones who triggered the coup because they felt the argument was drifting too far the other way. And I think you know that Erdogan, I think, has in principle applied to join the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, and Turkey is already an observer there, though I can't find anything on the government website to show that there is actually a formal application. But it shows the temptation. If we can't go west, go east. And after all, where is the growth? Well, people can say that Europe is a dying continent. That it doesn't have its own reproduction rate because of the fall in the size of families. So you go elsewhere where the much greater growth opportunities lie. And I can't see why there shouldn't be a temptation, except that people like Levi Jeans and they like Coca-Cola and they like McDonald's, of all places. Please.
I'd like to switch to another critical topic. Tayyip Erdogan may not care much about Cyprus, but he does care about Palestine.
Yeah.
He's had a long relationship with Hamas, as you know.
Yeah.
But he has also rebuilt relations with Israel, or was in the process of doing that over the last few years. But the point I'd like to make is that opposition to American policy towards Israel isn't just Islamist. It isn't just Erdogan, it goes across the board in Turkey. All the opposition parties have more or less supported Erdogan's attacks on America over their unstinting, unconditional support for Israel in the light of what the ghastly things we've seen happening in Gaza. And I really have a worry that once the war in Gaza is over, what will happen is that the Americans will go back to doing nothing about the Middle East. And it's up to ourselves, in combination with Turkey, etc., to try and at least use the opportunity to work towards a two-state solution. And I think we ought to be in talks with the Turks about that, regardless of the differences we may have over our region.
Yes, well, I mean, I think the issue is whether our talking to the Turks about this.
Could you speak?
Sorry, I think the issue would be whether we'd have much effect. I mean, when I was younger in the Foreign Office, it was always said that the European Union had tried to insert itself into the Israel-Palestinian relationship and never got very far because we couldn't do anything without the Americans being there. And if the Americans really walk away, which I think is unlikely if Biden stays president, I think he'll remain committed. Kieran will have a much more experienced view of these things. I think if the it's very hard for us to take a different policy from where the Americans are and expect it to have much effect. So we should definitely talk to the Turks about all these regional problems because they're much closer to them than we are. They're much more involved, and they give us great insights. And there are areas where we may opportunistically spot places where we can do things together and bring in other countries. But I think on the fundamental problem, we won't get far without the Americans.
Well, I worked a lot with Lakhdar Brahimi, whom I admired greatly. He's the former foreign minister of Algeria, and he was UN Special Representative in various key conflict states. And he always said to me, feel good is easy, do good is hard. And do good very often requires a degree of restraint in what you say in public. And one of the problems with President Erdogan's public statements, and understandable though they are, is that it means that he will have zero influence with the Israelis for some considerable time. And how do you get a two-state solution without finding a driver of it? Because Israel has been moving steadily right for the past several decades, actually. And Bibi Netanyahu voted against Oslo. He's got no interest whatsoever in a two-state solution. He's enthralled to the ultra-nationalists. I see that there was a Labour a Tory front bench spokesman who was suspended for talking about between the river and the sea, because that was regarded as pro-Palestinian. But if you read the recent remarks by Mr. Smotrich, who's an Israeli minister, he's also spoken about between the river and the sea, but he has a different meaning, which is between cleansed of Palestinians who must either accept their second-rate status or be encouraged to leave. So we're in a very difficult position, and one of the reasons for it is because the Americans and everybody else for the last 20 years have neglected making a really serious effort at negotiating a two-state solution. I used to know the late Saeed Erekat, and he said, imagine it's a pizza. We're supposed to be negotiating over the pizza, but all the time the Israelis are eating the pizza, so there's less and less left to negotiate over. And Smotrich recently announced that the doubling of settlers in Area C, which is the 60% of the West Bank which is under sole Israeli control, and that means, and there is a creeping de facto annexation of large areas of the West Bank. So the actual number one question is it already too late to have a two-state solution? Because I mean, how do you do it? I mean, how do you get rid of how do you persuade or force the settlers who are there now to withdraw in very considerable numbers? It used to be doable by exchanges of territory of equivalent value, so that the settlers kept the the large blocks near Jerusalem. But now the settlement areas are to make a contiguous Palestinian state completely impossible. And there is anyway less and less territory. And one of the things that, by the way, I think has got inadequate attention in the press is that since the crisis in Gaza, the settlers have been more and more violent in the West Bank. And there are, I think, 2 or 3 small Bedouin villages, and the Bedouin are the poorest and most marginalized of all Israel's citizens or citizens of Palestine, have been forced out of their areas, and there have been a larger number of Palestinians killed in the West Bank since the 7th of October than I think in the, certainly at a faster rate than in the rest of the year, and this year has had a higher rate of Palestinians in the West Bank killed than in any recent year. So it's just a horrible situation, and the Americans are a bit to blame because what are the Abraham Accords? They are agreements between Israel and countries which weren't at war with Israel. So they're called peace accords, but I mean they're not. I mean they're peace accords with people you're already at peace with, and the actual issue, which is Israel-Palestine, has not received any attention whatsoever, except in crisis management mode. And that's the problem. I don't agree, by the way, that Biden's support for Israel has been unconditional. Certainly he made remarks like that in the early stages, but the signals coming out of Washington increasingly are stop it, humanitarian pauses, and you've got to conduct your campaign in accordance with international humanitarian law. And the point about that is that the issue of war crimes or compliance with international humanitarian law is not reciprocal. So it doesn't matter from that point of view that the Palestinians committed war crimes. That's not a justification for Israel to commit war crimes. And killing large numbers of Palestinians with bombs that have huge collateral damage is, in my opinion, is a war crime. And a war crime is a war crime. And the Americans need to speak up a lot because they're the only ones who can stop it. And of course, let's think about it in geopolitical terms. Mr. Putin is delighted for 2 reasons. One is that he assumes that weaponry that was headed to Ukraine may be diverted to Israel, and secondly, it strengthens his argument with the countries of the Third World of the South. Look, these people, they're not on your side. They're on the side of Israel, and they failed. I mean, have they managed to keep peace in the Middle East? No. Have they managed to keep peace in Ukraine? No. Have they managed to keep peace in the Balkans? No. Did they manage to keep peace in Iraq and Syria? No. So you better align yourselves with us.
You have time for one more?
Yes, so just one brief one. It's very interesting how the subject moved away from Republic of Turkey, EU, to the surrounding area. And that shows again, I hate sounding pre-Copernicus as Turkey is the center of the world, but it's interesting the role Turkey plays in that area. And it is very sad actually in reference to what Kieran was saying about Europe being Christian now. Turkey used to be called club. Yes, club.
Well, exactly. Because they're not Christian, really.
They're not Christian club. But also, Turkey used to be called a secular country during the times when Turkey had applied to Europe. And it would have been a fantastic solution to the whole problem. And having neglected that, Turkey is now today called an Islamic country. And developments are getting worse and worse.
I think we just about. Sorry, did you have a question, or you were just? Yeah. I think. Are we done?
Well, I think we need to thank our 2 wonderful